Here is a number that ought to change how you plan every audit. Across investigated data incidents, a substantial and growing share do not originate inside the organization at all. They come through a vendor, a supplier, a contractor, someone in the chain. The perimeter you have been carefully protecting is not where the door is. And here is what makes it worse. Under the Act, when your processor leaks data, it is your breach, your liability, your notification, your penalty. I watched a client learn this in real time. Their payroll vendor had an exposed database. The client's first reaction was relief. Not us, they said, their vendor. And I had to explain, gently, that from the board's perspective, there is no such thing as their vendor. There is only you. So what will this chapter give you? You will audit technical safeguards, identity and access management, encryption and logging, and cloud considerations. Then you will move outward, vendor due diligence, processor contracts, cross-border transfers, and vendor monitoring techniques that actually work. And finally, incident response, breach records, and testing notification processes properly. This is the chapter about everything you do not control and are responsible for anyway. Let us begin. So let us start with security safeguards, and I want to address something immediately. The Act says reasonable security safeguards. Reasonable. And auditors hate that word. But here is how I have learned to think about it. Reasonable is not vague, it is relative. Reasonable for a corner shop holding 200 customer names is not reasonable for a bank holding health and financial records for lakhs of people. So the question is never, are these safeguards reasonable in the abstract? The question is, are they reasonable for this data, this volume, this sensitivity, this threat environment? Let me give you an example that made this concrete for me. A small diagnostics lab, 40 employees. They held test results. Health data, deeply sensitive. Their security was, honestly, what you would expect from a 40-person business. Shared logins, no encryption, one password for the results portal written on a card at reception. Now, would that be acceptable for a company with 40 employees holding a list of newsletter subscribers? Probably yes. Nobody expects enterprise security from a small business. But they were not holding newsletter subscribers. They were holding people's diagnoses. Do you see how the answer flips entirely? Same organization size, same budget, completely different standard. So here is my rule. Never assess safeguards against a benchmark. Assess them against the harm. Ask, if this failed tomorrow, what happens to the people in this data? Start there. The controls follow. So now let us get specific. And I want to start with the control that fails more often than any other. Access. Here is the reason. Access is granted constantly and revoked almost never. Every joiner gets access, every mover accumulates it, and every leaver, in theory, loses it. In theory. Let me show you my favorite test. It takes 1 hour and it works every single time. I ask HR for a list of everyone who left in the last 6 months. Then I ask IT for a list of currently active accounts. Then I compare. At a client, that comparison found 17 active accounts belonging to people who no longer work there. One of them had left 14 months earlier. His account still had access to the customer database. Nobody had noticed because nobody had ever looked. And here is the second test, movers. The person who spent 3 years in collections then moved to marketing. Did they lose the collections access? Almost never. So now the marketing team has someone who can see everyone's payment defaults. That is not a hypothetical. I have found it 3 times. So what do you test? Joiners, movers, leavers. All 3. Then privileged accounts, separately, because those are the ones that matter most. And shared accounts, which are accountability's death. Ask one question. If something happened at 2 in the morning, could you name the person? If not, you do not have access management. You have access. So let us talk about encryption. And I want to warn you about the single most misleading answer in all of auditing. Yes, it is encrypted. That sentence means almost nothing. And people say it with total sincerity. So here is what you ask next. Encrypted where? Because there are two places, and organizations often only do one. In transit, meaning while it moves across a network, and at rest, meaning while it sits in storage. I audited a client who told me confidently that everything was encrypted. Their website had a proper certificate, data moved securely, all true. Then I asked about the database, and the database was sitting there, unencrypted, on a server in a rack. They were not lying, they just answered a narrower question than the one I asked. And here is the follow up that really matters: who holds the keys? Because if the same team that administers the database also holds the encryption keys, what exactly has encryption protected against? Not them. Now, logging. Same trap. Everyone logs. So I ask, who reads them? At one client, logging was excellent, comprehensive, retained, well structured, and nobody had opened them in 11 months. They were writing a diary nobody read. So test three things. Is it logged? Is it reviewed? And does anything happen when the log shows something wrong? If the loop does not close, you are collecting evidence for an investigation that will never happen. So let us talk about cloud, and I want to name the misunderstanding that causes most of the problems I find. People believe that moving to cloud means the provider handles security. And they are partly right, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. Here is the reality. The provider secures the infrastructure. You secure what you put on it. That division is called shared responsibility, and I have never once found an organization that could tell me precisely where their side started. Let me give you an example. A client had migrated to a major cloud provider. Excellent choice, world-class infrastructure. And they had a storage bucket, publicly readable, containing 4 years of customer invoices. Was the cloud insecure? Not at all. The provider had done everything right. The client had made it public with 3 clicks and forgotten. So what do you test? First, does anyone actually know the split? Ask them to describe it. If they cannot, that gap is your finding. Second, configuration. Public access, default settings, anything exposed. Ask for a configuration review and see whether one has ever been done. Third, and this is the DPDP specific one, location. Where is the data physically? Which region? Which replicas? Because cloud makes geography invisible and the law does not. I asked a client where their data lived. They said, in the cloud. And I said, yes, but which country? They had never asked. So we move outward now, past your own walls. And here is where I want you to shift your mindset. Because most due diligence is theater, and everyone involved knows it. Let me describe the ritual. Vendor is selected. Procurement sends a questionnaire, 50 questions. Vendor answers yes to 48 of them. Someone files it. Contract signed. Has anyone learnt anything? No. Because a questionnaire measures a vendor's ability to answer a questionnaire. So how do you audit this properly? Ask 3 questions. First, was diligence done before the contract or after? Because after is not diligence, it is paperwork. Second, did anyone verify anything? A single claim, any claim? I audited a client whose vendor had answered yes to independent security testing. Nobody had asked for the report. When I did, it did not exist. Third, was any vendor ever rejected? Ever? If the answer is no, in 8 years across 200 vendors, then diligence is not a gate, it is a turnstile. Let me tell you about a client who did this well. Their procurement head told me, we walked away from a cheaper vendor last year because they could not tell us where their sub-processors were. It cost us 4 months. That is diligence. It has a cost. If yours never costs anything, it is not doing anything. So the contract. And I want to reframe how you read one. Because most auditors read contracts looking for clauses, and that is the wrong instinct. Read a contract asking one question. If this vendor fails, what can I actually do about it? Let me show you why. A client had a beautiful processor contract. Every clause present: confidentiality, security obligations, breach notification, the lot. Genuinely well drafted. Then I asked, what is your audit right? And they pointed at the clause. Client may audit processor upon reasonable notice. So I said, have you ever? No. Would they let you? They think so. Then I read further. Reasonable notice was defined as 90 days. 90 days. Do you know what a vendor can do in 90 days? Everything. So here is what to look for. Audit rights and whether they are exercisable in practice or only in principle. Sub-processor terms, and critically, whether you get told before or after a new one is engaged. Breach notification timelines, because if your vendor has 72 hours and you have less, you have already failed. That last one catches people. Your obligation to the board does not pause while your vendor decides how to tell you. And deletion at termination. What happens to your data when the relationship ends? Read that clause. It is usually the weakest one in the document. So let us talk about transfers, and I want to start with an observation. Most cross-border transfers are not decisions. They are accidents of architecture. Here is what I mean. Nobody sits in a meeting and says, let us send customer data to Ireland. What happens is, someone picks a cloud region because it was the default, or a vendor's support team happens to sit in Manila, or an analytics tool processes data wherever its infrastructure lives. The data crossed a border. Nobody decided anything. Let me give you an example. A client mapped their transfers for me. 3, they said, confident. So we did a walkthrough of one system. Their customer support platform was hosted in Singapore. Their email provider processed in the United States. Their chatbot vendor had engineers accessing data from 3 countries. 3 became 11 in one afternoon. And here is the part that catches everyone. Access is transfer. If an engineer in another country can view the data, it has moved, even if the database never did. I asked one client whether their offshore development team had production access. They said yes for support, and they had never counted that as a transfer. So what do you test? Build the actual transfer map from the data flows, not the register. Then for each one, ask what mechanism permits it and whether the country is restricted. Follow the access, not just the storage. So you did the diligence, you signed the contract, and now what? 3 years pass and nobody looks again. That is the pattern I find, and it is the most dangerous thing in the entire vendor life cycle. Because vendors change, they get acquired, they move infrastructure, they lose their security lead, they add sub-processors. And your contract from 3 years ago describes a company that no longer exists. So how do you monitor without auditing every vendor every year? Because you cannot. Nobody has that budget. Here is what works. Tier them. Your top 10 vendors by data sensitivity get real attention. The rest get lighter touch. That is not laziness, that is risk-based thinking. Then, for the top tier, use triggers. Any change of ownership, any incident, any new sub-processor, any contract renewal. Those are your review points, not the calendar. Let me tell you about a client who caught something this way. Their document storage vendor was acquired. Under the old ownership, data stayed in India. The acquirer consolidated infrastructure to Singapore. Nobody told the client. They found out because their monitoring flagged the acquisition and someone asked one question. One question. That is all monitoring needs to be sometimes. And use what exists, their certifications, their test reports, their incident disclosures. Ask for them annually. If a vendor cannot produce a current report, that silence is information. So let us talk about incidents, and I want to ask you something first. What is the most useful thing in an incident response plan? Most people say the procedure. I would argue it is the phone numbers. Because at 2 in the morning, when something is genuinely on fire, nobody reads a 40-page document. They call someone. So when I audit incident response, I start with the boring things. Is the plan findable at midnight? Are the contact numbers current? I once found a plan naming a security lead who had left 18 months earlier as the primary escalation. Then I look at the register, and here is what I want you to watch for. Suspiciously few incidents. A client showed me their register. 2 incidents in 3 years. 2. For a company processing lakhs of transactions. So I asked their service desk team what they do when someone reports an email sent to the wrong customer. And they said, "Oh, we just apologize and fix it. It does not go anywhere." Do you see? They had dozens of incidents. 2 got recorded because only 2 were big enough to feel official. So test the definition. What counts as an incident here? Then test the on-ramp. If a junior employee spots something at 6 in the evening, what do? And check the clock. When did it start? When was it noticed? When was it escalated? Those gaps are where your findings live. So we come to breach notification. And I want to be blunt about something. This is the one control where you cannot afford to learn on the day. Because here is the situation. A breach happens. The clock starts. And now, under enormous pressure with incomplete information, your organization must decide whether to notify, whom, and what to say. If they have never rehearsed that, they will get it wrong. Every time. So how do you audit it? Not by reading the plan, by testing the decision. Here is what I do. I give them a scenario, not a hypothetical, a specific one. An employee emailed a spreadsheet with 2,000 customer records to a personal address before resigning, discovered 11 days later. Then I sit back and watch. Who gets called first? Is this a breach? Who decides? What is the clock and when did it start? On the day of the email or the day of discovery? Do you notify the board? Do you tell the 2,000 people? I ran this at a client and the room argued for 40 minutes. Legal said one thing, security another. The DPO was not even in the escalation chain. 40 minutes in a meeting room with coffee. Imagine that at midnight during a real one. So test the muscle, not the manual, and check whether they have ever done a drill. If not, the plan is fiction.